Good morning. My name is Chip Gibbons. I'm the Policy Director of Defending Rights in Dissent. It is 10:26 here in our nation's capital. It's 7:26 on the West Coast and 9:26 in Chicago. And of course, it is other times in other time zones as well. I recognize we're getting a late start today. I want to apologize. One of our panelists is having some technical difficulties, and we are working to resolve them. I suppose today's question is, how many Espionage Act experts can we get to sort of get the streaming program to work? Because we're all in the back room trying to figure it out. But until then, we're going to start the panel, and hopefully the missing panelists will join shortly. So let me introduce today's panel as we have them. We have Carey Shenkman. Carey is the co-author of A Century of Repression, the Espionage Act of 1917, from World War I to the War on Terror. Carey also testified as an Espionage Act expert in the extradition hearing of Julian Assange. He testified for the defense. He also is interviewed about his expertise on the Espionage Act on the Primary Sources podcast that we put on. Carey is my go-to expert on the Espionage Act and is absolutely one of the leading experts on the Espionage Act in the country. We also are joined by Kevin Gostola. Kevin is the managing editor of Shadowproof. He has, I believe, covered more Espionage Act prosecutions than any other journalist today, including the court-martial of Chelsea Manning and the extradition of Julian Assange. He is also the author of a forthcoming book. This one is called Guilty of Journalism, The Political Case Against Julian Assange. And joining us shortly, I hope, will be Marjorie Cohn. Marjorie is a professor emerita at Thomas Jefferson School of Law. We're a former criminal defense attorney and a past president of the National Lawyers Guild. She writes a column for Truth Out on legal and political issues, and it is my go-to reading on most legal questions these days, and has been for the past couple of years. I don't believe we have Marjorie yet. No, we don't. So I'm going to jump the original order and call on you, Carey. One of the, well, let me just start. There's three laws that are the warrant is based on. One is 18 U.S.C. 2071, which deals with the concealment, removal, or mutilation of government property and documents. It carries up to 3 years in prison. Then there's 18 U.S.C. 793, gathering, transmitting, or losing defense information, which is part of the Espionage Act, which carries 10 years in prison potentially. And then there is 18 U.S.C. 1519, destruction, alteration, or falsification of records in federal investigations. It requires the intent to impede, obstruct, or influence government matters or investigations. And it carries 20 years. In prison potentially. Carey, as in my opinion, the leading expert on the Espionage Act, could you explain what 793E is, assuming the audience does not have your sort of in-depth knowledge of the Espionage Act, and just give me your sort of initial thoughts on its use in this investigation?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for your very kind words, Chip. So the Espionage Act has broadly been the topic of national, actually world headlines for the last few weeks. Is this 100-year-old antiquated law that's being used and revived now against Trump in the search of Mar-a-Lago. And actually, we have more information about the way that the Espionage Act formed the legal basis for the search, because on Friday, a federal judge made the step to make parts of the underlying affidavit publicly available. That means the justification that the government used to support that search. However, the affidavit is still heavily redacted, possibly about 2/3 redacted. So we know a little more information, but perhaps not as much as we'd like. So taking a step back, what does it mean when Section 793E of the Espionage Act was used as a legal basis? Effectively, the government was saying that they found or felt there was probable cause that Trump had unauthorized access. He possessed national defense information for that he was not authorized to receive. And for a former head of state, that's actually a pretty remarkable position, because throughout his whole tenure, he was in fact authorized to receive national defense information. He's the highest ranking official with authority over classification. But now that he's out of office, they're taking this position, which is actually, and maybe Kevin will be able to comment more on this later, it's actually consistent with the position that the Justice Department has taken with whistleblowers for the last 10 or 15 years in their prosecutions. So what is the Espionage Act? First of all, when we're talking about the Espionage Act, most of the time we're not talking about espionage as you or I might commonly understand it. We're not talking about classic spies giving information to a foreign power. What we're talking about is a law that broadly punishes the receipt, the retention, and the communication of what's called national defense information. It can apply to government employees, members of the general public, journalists, and even non-US citizens. And if you hear the term national defense information, because a lot of the coverage around the Trump search is about the high level of classification of the information. In terms of an Espionage Act investigation and prosecution, this is all completely irrelevant. The classification, the level of the classification of the underlying information is completely a red herring. It has no bearing on any criminal process against Trump. Because you might hear national defense information, it sounds like important stuff, right? But it does not mean military secrets, codes, or closely guarded information, does not need to be classified, and it can include evidence of torture, war crimes, corruption, or government criminality.
So I guess my question for you, Carey, is how surprised are you that this particular provision of the Espionage Act is the one they are going after Trump on? I believe there's another provision, I think it's 793D, I might be getting it wrong, or maybe it's C, that is almost verbatim the same, but covers someone with authorized access and carries the same penalty. Are you surprised and would also criminalize unlawful retention? So you could have authorized access and unlawfully retain the information, or you could have unauthorized access and unlawfully retain the information. How are you surprised this is what they're going after, or do you think this is the most logical case here?
So I'll admit, I was actually originally surprised. So the provision you're referring to, the Espionage Act is ridiculously complicated. It has many different provisions, and even the leading academic article on it, it's over 100 pages long. I mean, there's so many different subparts, and it self-references. But there are a few other provisions under 793 that myself and actually some other law professors were commenting were high contenders, because we didn't know what portion of the Espionage Act was originally implicated in the search. We just knew that Section 793 was, but there are all these subsections that could mean different things, as you point out. And one of the key splits in that part of the Espionage Act is a split between 793D and 793E. And this distinction was made around 1950 in the amendments of the Act. But as you point out, there's one provision that applies to the lawful possession of national defense information or documents, as opposed to the unauthorized possession. And a lot of folks were guessing that Trump was being searched under the lawful possession prong, because a head of state or former head of state would have lawful possession of classified information. However, when it came out that the claim was that he had unauthorized possession of that information, I paused for a moment, and as I thought more about it, thought, well, this is entirely consistent with the Justice Department's position in many of these cases. I can actually pull up, in terms of the whistleblower prosecutions, I did a search over cases in just the last 10 years. And for instance, Daniel Hale, who is a drone whistleblower, he was charged under this provision and convicted for retention of documents. Terry Albury, who is an FBI whistleblower, he was also charged under 793E for unlawful retention. There were other cases coming down, I believe, that Jeffrey Sterling, who was a CIA whistleblower, was charged with the count of unlawful retention under 793E. So these are some examples of what the Justice Department has done in the past. And I think that it actually is a bad sign for the future of whistleblower prosecutions, because I think it normalizes this position that any official who possesses information in a way that is contrary to what the current administration wishes them to have is susceptible to this provision under the Espionage Act.
Yeah, and I'm not defending the prosecution of Daniel Hale, nor am I defending Donald Trump, but like in the Hale case, I mean, he accessed information that was not germane to his current job. So there is a case to be made that he didn't have authorized access to it. It just, I don't know. I was one of those people who did not think this would be the provision under the Espionage Act that they would be investigating Trump under. Kevin, you, as Carey has mentioned, have covered a number of Espionage Act cases. How do you respond to the use of 793E in this particular fact pattern?
Yeah, so forgive me, I'm not a lawyer, and so it's possible that I might see things.
You should be asking. The lawyer should be asking for forgiveness on that one, Kevin.
But it's possible that I might end up citing other provisions of the Espionage Act in order to make a point. And so I realize that Donald Trump is not necessarily being prosecuted under this section. But a while ago, before we knew what the foundation was based upon this affidavit of, what specifically they were looking to obtain when the FBI deployed and searched Mar-a-Lago, I went through some of these past cases to look at the history of this Espionage Act being applied to people who just simply took documents home and kept them in their possession. Because while technically speaking, it doesn't really matter, their cases are not distinguishable from the case of Daniel Hale or Jeffrey Sterling or Terry Albury. This is a different universe of Espionage Act prosecutions that we're veering into. I mean, for the most part, the cases that I've covered usually have a component of the defendant or the person who is the whistleblower or leaker having gone to the media or gone to the press. They typically have revealed that information, and we know it. And when the Justice Department is prosecuting them and making some claim about what the risk of damage to national security was going to be, we actually contest their claims because we know what the contents are of the information. In this case, we don't know, because Donald Trump took all this material, packed it in vans, brought it to Mar-a-Lago from the White House, put it in a storage room, or had it in, we've heard about a leather-bound book that may have been in, maybe it was in his room, could have been in his office. We know there are various locations within Mar-a-Lago in which documents were seized by FBI agents. And I think it more closely aligns with this universe of cases against people for unlawful retention. So, just to give a few examples, in 2021, there was a woman who was a 48-year-old FBI intelligence analyst. She had a top secret security clearance. Her name was Kendra Kingsbury, and she was charged with willfully retaining this information in violation of the Espionage Act. Allegedly, she took documents on FBI counterterrorism operations, as well as CIA documents on Al-Qaeda in Africa. And she kept these at her home in Dodge City, Kansas. We never saw them. We don't really know what her plans were for the documents, according to the indictment and the information that was presented by the Justice Department. There was a CIA contractor in 2018 named Reynaldo Regis who pled guilty to retaining classified information. He was accused of copying classified information into personal notebooks. FBI agents found approximately 60 notebooks containing classified information when they searched his Maryland home. Again, we don't know what he was planning to do. He just had them. It's similar to what Donald Trump was doing. We don't know what his intentions were with the information yet. We can speculate. We can bet that if he's going to have a 2024 presidential campaign, he might find some of the information useful to his campaign, but we don't really know. There's also been reporting from some journalists who have spoken to sources about how he just wanted to keep these as like keepsakes. That's what Thomas Drake said to our prior Rights and Dissent webinar, that they were that these were things that were like jewels that he could keep to show that he was once president, he had access to this material, and he's just going to have these as his prized possessions. That's where you might classify the Kim Jong-un letters that were reported to have been in his possession. So anyways, I don't have to give any more examples. I think the point is clear that this is not something that the prosecutors at the Justice Department distinguish, but I do believe as members of the public, as we assess the nature of the Espionage Act, we look over its history. We listen to people like Carey. We listen to those who work at organizations like Rights and Dissent, who have a record of challenging the Espionage Act and pushing for reform. I do think it's important to differentiate here that we don't have this ability to stick up for Donald Trump and say, oh, well, that information was in the public interest because he sat on it. And that, to me, is like the crucial issue here with the difference between Donald Trump and any other whistleblower or leaking case that I've reported on. He was keeping this as personal property when, in fact, government documents belong to all of us, and it belongs in the National Archive. And obviously, I recognize that some of it's so sensitive that it may never see the light of day, or we might have to wait 30 to 50 years to see these records. But it still belongs in the major and massive archive of material that documented Donald Trump's presidency. And it's not for some rich former president to keep at his estate and show off to people who come in and out, who are from all over the world, who he might just want to show that he was a really good person who had access to all of this sensitive material at one point.
Yeah, Kevin, I think you're getting into a really important distinction for me. And obviously, with all the redactions, there's still a lot of speculation here. But we know that the other two statutes in play, besides the Espionage Act, one is concealment, removal, or mutilation of government properties and documents, and one is destruction, alteration, or falsification of records in federal investigations or bankruptcy proceedings, a topic Trump knows a lot about, with the intent to impede, obstruct, or influence government matters and investigations. With whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning and Daniel Hale, or journalists like Julian Assange, these are people who are fighting for transparency, right? They think the government is doing something in the dark that we, the people, have a right to know about it, and I share their beliefs. Donald Trump has not been a transparent president. He has been fighting with the National Archives. He has justified not turning over information to the National Archives, claiming they're being partisan by releasing the records to the January 6th Commission. So once again, I don't know what Donald Trump was thinking here. I mean, I would hate to ever be responsible for divining Donald Trump's thoughts. But even so, the indictment, or I'm sorry, affidavit, I keep calling it indictment, the affidavit is so redacted, we don't really know. But it does seem like this is somebody potentially who's trying to thwart transparency. And I think if that's the case, we need to make a very strong juxtaposition between somebody who is trying to thwart transparency by removing documents so the National Archives can't have them, so congressional oversight committees can't have them, and so ultimately the public can't have them, and somebody who is disgusted by government secrecy and government criminality and goes to the media so that the media will go to the people. Chelsea Manning said in her chat logs that she was taking her actions because she wanted to spark a debate on the nature of asymmetrical warfare in the 21st century. Daniel Hale talked about how he was inspired to his actions by the fact that Barack Obama was talking about how there were high standards for civilian casualties in drone strikes, something that was clearly a lie. So we have these people who are fighting for transparency, and I don't think Donald Trump deserves to be, even have his name said in the same contact to them. I want to give you an update on our missing panelist, Marjorie Cohn. She is having technical problems, but she is weighing in on Facebook and has asked me to read some of her comments. One of the big questions I had for her was because she was a professor of criminal procedure, was to just sort of explain what this document even is. And I apologize, we skipped over her question, and if it's confusing what's going on, that's on me. But she's waited and said, affidavits typically include critical information about an investigation, including why the government wants to search a particular place and what evidence they expect to find. They contain statements from informants and indicate avenues that will be pursued during the investigation. It is highly unusual to unseal a search warrant affidavit before criminal charges are filed. In fact, affidavits are generally only unsealed after the defendant makes a motion to suppress evidence seized, arguing that his or her Fourth Amendment rights have been violated. No charges have been filed in the case yet, but due to a strong public interest in search of Trump's home and the seizure of hundreds of classified documents, the judge unsealed the affidavit with extensive reactions. The redactions in the affidavit conceal reports from informants and other information that support the probable cause determination. It says the FBI has not yet identified all potential criminal confederates or located all evidence. The judge found probable cause to believe that the search would turn up evidence of 3 federal felonies, one under the Espionage Act for obstruction, one for obstruction, which carries 20 years, and the other for mutilation, which carries 3 years. This section, apparently one or more, I'm missing part of it. Apparently one or more informants told the government that additional boxes of classified material were still at Mar-a-Lago, but their identities have been redacted from the affidavit. I guess, Carey, you read the affidavit. I know it's heavily redacted. We're told it was narrowly redacted. What was the exact phrase? I had this up in front of me. We were told
narrowly tailored.
Yes, narrowly tailored to serve government's legitimate interest in the integrity of the ongoing investigation. Given that like 3 or 4 pages are redacted at a time, I would hate to see what a non-narrow tailoring was. But even with all those redactions, what's the most significant thing that jumped out at you?
Well, actually, I mean, I hate to keep going back to this, but I do think the circumstances of this are the most significant to me, because as Marjorie pointed out, this is highly unusual. And I do think that there's a component about this, a large component, that it is at risk for politicization. There was a lot of pressure from mainstream media outlets. So actually, a few weeks ago, the Times and many other outlets moved to intervene in the case in Florida to try to get access, for the reason that there was a strong public interest in the search of a former president of the United States. And the Times is actually pushing for disclosure with at most redaction of, they said, limited information to protect any compelling interest. So we had a portion of this affidavit, but huge parts of it redacted. And this also goes back to what Kevin was bringing up, that we don't know, and we really can't probe the government's claims. There was claims of communication back and forth and requests made and negotiations regarding the materials, but much of the content of and descriptions of what was actually included are left out. There's some folks who are speculating that these redactions are completely valid because there was high-level classified information involved. That's what some of the sources have been saying to the media. I think it's unlikely that there's going to be actual information. It's there is unlikely to appear in the actual affidavit. So from my point of view, this is actually the Justice Department and FBI saying, trust us to determine what the public has to know about this. And we're only going to release the information that we feel should be released. So I'm actually really curious to hear from Kevin and Marjorie, their views on the political circumstances of the redactions and how this fits in to the lack of transparency in Espionage Act cases as a whole.
And the subject of the lack of transparency in Espionage Act cases is a topic that we probed in the previous Defending Rights and Dissent panel that this is a companion to. I apologize. I meant to mention the previous panel at the beginning. I was a little bit flustered by navigating the technical difficulties, but several weeks ago we had a panel called the Espionage Act, Setting the Record Straight, with Tom Drake, John Kiriakou, both of whom were indicted under the Espionage Act, as well as Jesselyn Radick, who represented them, and also Snowden and Hale. And one of the things I brought up is these Espionage Act cases are incredibly non-transparent. I'm currently embroiled in litigation with the FBI, the NSA, the DOD, and the DOJ. We'll see if I have any trouble next time I get on a plane about the investigation into the drone papers leak or publication by The Intercept, which culminated in the prosecution of Daniel Hale. And the government won't even admit there ever was an investigation into the drone papers, right? They have this whole indictment. They say he leaked this document. It was published on this day. He met this reporter. They spoke at this panel on this day. And like anyone reading this knows, reporter 2, Jeremy Scahill, right? Publication of The Intercept. You're giving us the dates. You're giving us the topics, but they are claiming that they can't confirm or deny what it was. There was a very early Obama era Espionage Act investigation where the judge admitted at sentencing he didn't know what the information was that was given. He didn't know what the effect of it was, and that the court was in the dark, but he knew it was serious, and he gave a serious penalty as a result. I feel very strongly that whether you think Trump belongs in jail or he's being persecuted, everyone has a shared interest in this being a transparent investigation. And given that sort of part of the pageantry of an Espionage Act trial is this information is so secret, we can't even tell the jury and the judge what it is. This is the worst possible avenue to pursue Donald Trump on. That is just my opinion. Kevin, what's your take on Carey's question that he so helpfully posed for you?
About the politics?
Yeah, politics.
Yeah, so first, I'll just give a nod to what I think we could call the left-wing view, because I think it actually is an important perspective to take into account, and I believe it actually probably has some harmony with the work that Rights and Dissent has done challenging FBI abuses. So I don't think there will be anybody pushing back on this idea that what we might be observing and why I think we have a conflicted view and why there's a lot of nuance in the way that we make our presentation is because at its core, it does seem like there is this war happening internally among the U.S. security agencies over what to do with a former president who they didn't trust to keep their state secrets protected at all during the course of his time in the White House, that they were always concerned that he was going to spill the beans or talk about any of this with his counterparts, if he was meeting leaders of countries, that diplomats might learn information in foreign countries who would maybe share this information with adversaries, that they are always like taking this very leery posture towards Donald Trump when it came to what they were going to show him as far as military or national security secrets. And I think that like what we're seeing, it's very possible that when they're contemplating the information, the nature of the information that could be in his possession, again, we have to remember they don't know. I've heard some people say, why would they take so long to conduct this search? Well, I'm not certain that they fully recognize the scale of the information that was taken from Trump in the beginning. Like they heard from the National Archives that Donald Trump has some boxes. And it wasn't until the National Archives is going through and finding classified material in these records that I think the hair stands up on the back of their head and the Justice Department becomes involved. And then the counterintelligence division at the FBI and others become a part of retrieving these documents. And I think because there is this narrative, particularly in the echo chamber of the right-wing media, that there is this this war among national security agencies against Donald Trump to make sure he fails, to make sure he's never elected again. I do think that that's why the Justice Department has meticulously moved so carefully, because they know what the perspective is that dominates at least 40 to 45% of the public's perspective on all of this. And as much as like the FBI is known to have a track record of abusing its power, I do think that they are well aware that they have to be very careful about how they proceed. But like one view that's been put forward by Bill Arkin, who's a really good seasoned journalist, is that the FBI just thought that they could show us their work, that they had dotted their I's and crossed their T's, and everything would be fine and there wouldn't be a backlash. But in the immediate to the search, there was this like coalition that formed around Trump, supporting him among Republicans. And you even saw only a few Democrats willing to speak up, and they wanted to just wait and see what was happening. I think now with the search warrant affidavit, people are a little more outspoken about it, and you even see some Republicans clamming up, because it does look like technically, if you're going by the letter of the law and the way in which the Justice Department has prosecuted defendants in its history, that Donald Trump did violate the Espionage Act, or that you at least have the elements that are necessary to bring a charge against Donald Trump. That doesn't get us to the question of whether you should exercise discretion and charge Donald Trump. That's a separate question, but it does look like the elements were there to say to a judge, we have to go in, we believe that there are ongoing criminal violations, or at least use it as a pretext to swiftly get this material back into the hands of the government so that it was no longer loose and open to infiltration. We just have a story in the last week of this Ukrainian woman who was impersonating someone to move about the Mar-a-Lago estate. We see that the security was so lax that they could basically have gone into any of these rooms and taken materials if they wanted. It seems like people were able to move about pretty freely in the Mar-a-Lago estate. So those are some things to just put forward there about the politics of all of this prosecution. And I understand that people don't want to see Donald Trump let off the hook, but I suppose what I would say to them is that I share this viewpoint that we do have to be careful of how we proceed in legitimizing the Espionage Act through a prosecution of Donald Trump. And I'll just acknowledge that the New York Times, on the same day that the affidavit was unsealed, published an editorial in which they were documenting the events on January 6th as reason why the Justice Department had to bring charges. And I just put that forward to say that if you really think you want to hold a president accountable, it might be better to turn towards the issue of believing that he could declare the results of the election illegitimate and try to stay in power and then whip up people into a riot and frenzy and have them take over Capitol Hill, is something that is probably more worthy of deploying Justice Department resources rather than seeing the liberal mainstream press coalesce around this idea that we're going to protect the religion of the national security state and go after Donald Trump to show him that, not only are we willing to go after people who are dissident journalists like Julian Assange, who are against the CIA and aligned against U.S. And the superpower actions that they are engaged in around the world, but we're also not just going to go after whistleblowers and leakers, but we're also willing to use this law against former presidents because we take this so seriously. And I think that would just give the Espionage Act this like new life that would make it very difficult for people to reform. And we're already seeing that there are some Democratic liberal voices who equate asking or backing the repeal of the Espionage Act as treasonous because it has now ensnared Donald Trump, because we're not talking about the Espionage Act and Donald Trump in the same conversation, which I view as very dangerous.
Yeah, I've been having a lot of behind the scenes conversations with other advocates for Espionage Act reform, and my position has always been the more the conversation becomes about Trump and the less it becomes about the act, the more harmful that is for our efforts. And I do spot on, Kevin, agree with your analysis that there is a litany of offenses that Trump has been credibly accused of, violating the emoluments clause, trying to overturn an election, just all of the horrible, low-level, blatant grifting, and that there's been this attempt to sort of always ignore and like really serious offenses against democracy, right? Like crimes against our democracy, which I think are sort of the most serious types of crimes. But there's this sort of continued attempt by some in the Democratic Party leadership and in the media to always sort of ignore those and circle back into these sorts of like national security crimes. Take the Ukraine gate impeachment. I mean, Trump was accused of trying to get a foreign government to investigate the son of his political opponent in order to, influence an election. That's a very serious crime. But I had to turn the hearings off because every time I would turn them on, they'd be like, how important are Javelin missiles, right? It'd be like, and defending rights and dissent never weighed in on any of the impeachments. So I'm speaking only on my personal views. I thought they were both justified, but I thought the first one was really mishandled because you'd have Adam Schiff yelling, Ronald Reagan would have stood up to Putin. Ronald Reagan is, of course, probably, as a purely legal matter, the most impeachable president in U.S. history, right? Congress passed the Boland Amendment, said you can't fund Contras trying to overthrow the Sandinistas. He did it anyways. I mean, that is the most open shut textbook impeachment ever. And like we completely lost sight of in these hearings that I watched that Trump was committing a very serious crime about democracy and a lot of discussions about what U.S.-Ukraine policy should be. Obviously, as a civil liberties organization, we have no opinion on what that should be, but I think they really blew it. And I think this continued attempt to try to, for the inside the Beltway press, like the worst thing you can be is insufficiently enthusiastic about the national security state. And there's a lot of reasons to believe that's not true about Trump, right? He assassinates Soleimani. He gives the CIA control over drone strikes. Again, I'm not going to go through the whole list. So they just keep coming back to that. And with all the other crimes he's credibly accused of committing, it just seems like the worst possible things to focus on. Carey, I wonder if you have a take here. Or
100%. Yeah, I mean, this is what sticks out the most to me. And at the beginning, where I think Kevin brought up a really important point that there is I think a thematic distinction between someone who's charged under the Espionage Act, who either retains information with the intention of going to the press or takes it to the press, versus someone who's just taking it home for convenience or for their own career purposes. I think the important point to make is that from a legal perspective, the Justice Department does not, and courts do not distinguish between these cases. And that's why the implications of the Trump search and the stakes are so high, because whatever happens in this case, whether there's more of an investigation, whether there's any further criminal process, this effectively legitimizes a position that the Justice Department can apply in many different cases that are distinct from Trump, for defendants who look very different from Trump, who are revealing, speaking to the press in the public interest.
Yeah, and I just wanted to bring in some comments from some of the people in the chat box on Facebook. Paul Levy, who I believe is with Public Citizen, but I'm not sure, has commented that there are other instances where probable cause affidavit has been unsealed. He mentions the warrant affidavit justifying a search of the Disrupt J20 web host servers was made available to help limit the search. And he also says in some jurisdictions, the warrant affidavit generally becomes available after the warrant is executed. He's litigated this issue. And there's a third example he didn't mention, but that is on my mind, and I suspect is on Kevin's mind. after the raid of Solidarity and anti-war activists in the Midwest under the Obama years. They fought to have the probable cause affidavit unsealed, and Kevin wrote an entire analysis of it, which Defending Rights in Dissent has cited a bunch of times. Marjorie, if you are listening still, I would love to hear your take on the politics of the use of the Espionage Act and the level of transparency that we've had in this investigation. Are the redactions justifiable, or are we sort of going too far into secrecy? And then I guess my next question is the obvious question that everyone has been waiting for, and that is, should we still be concerned about the Espionage Act? Should we be concerned about it in general, but not in this case? Should we be concerned about it in this case, or is the Espionage Act good now? Carey?
Well,
yes, Kevin?
Well, I just wanted to pull on something which I think goes along with this question that you're asking, and it's what Carey was saying. But let's expand on it a little bit. So, if I, as a journalist, have documents post this Trump investigation, really, like, just what we've learned from the Assange case is that, and some other cases, is that precedent isn't only set through verdict. Precedent is also set through what they're able to obtain authorization to do, whether it involves getting a search warrant or it involves getting the permission of a judge to engage in wiretapping or eavesdropping, or the collection of your data from social media companies and or any internet accounts that you may have that could be useful to the U.S. government in investigating you. They can cast a wide net. You know, if we remember anything about the Associated Press scandal that happened, where they were up on like well over 100 different phone lines in order to try and catch one leaker, it wasn't even that targeted at all. Like it was a definition of a fishing expedition. They did not go after one particular phone to catch this leaker who they believed was the source of this story that was about an underwear bomber that was in Yemen, who the AP had obtained information about. They wanted to know how they knew that information for their story. So just to think about this in terms of what has actual consequence to the future and isn't just solely about the political future of Donald Trump. If you as a journalist have material, what Carey was saying was, if you have material and you are possessing it and you've obtained it from a source, okay? Now, the Justice Department doesn't have to know what source gave you the material. If they know you have the material, they could just come at you solely and threaten you with a prosecution to try and get you to cough up your source. And, you know, you yourself might have criminal liability just for the unlawful possession. And that's sort of what they're doing with Julian Assange, although he's actually, I'm trying to remember. Carey, do you remember if that's are there any possession charges against Julian? I think they're all just transmission. Do you remember?
I'll pull it up right now.
Anyways, the point I'm trying to make is that, like, what we're setting a standard for would be that journalists would be vulnerable to just simply agents coming in and taking their documents from them so that they could be reclaimed and protected by the U.S. government.
Carey, did you have the up in front of you, or do you have?
I'm pulling it up off the top of my head. Yeah, most of the counts were causing disclosure, conspiracy abating.
I don't think they're possession charges.
Yeah, I don't. There's a pure publication, but the majority of the counts are causing Manning to communicate, deliver, and transmit. But I don't believe there's any possession.
Okay. And then the other thing that is worth pointing out here is that, like, it is always worth saying in these conversations that the thing that would distinguish the general member of the public from any of these individuals is that, we don't sign non-disclosure agreements agreeing to like protect the security class, agreeing to abide by the security classification of particular documents, which does have, in a way, it is exonerating, because in order for that reason to believe standard to apply, you have to be able to convince the judge that there was some kind of training or education that went on the material. So no matter how many times I write about these stories, no matter how many times I claim to know about these documents, well, before I commit a crime, you're going to have U.S. officials in intelligence agencies who say, don't listen to him. He can't say that that wouldn't cause harm or exceptionally grave damage. He's not read in and he doesn't receive training. Well, that would also be true if I was prosecuted, that after the fact, I would not be guilty because I do not have this training. So no matter how much I talk, people like James Clapper or John Brennan, who get to go on TV and leak and not be prosecuted, are going to be able to say about me that I don't know what I'm talking about because I've never been trained.
So I just want to go to Marjorie Cohn, who is answering questions in the Facebook. I apologize. I'm a bit flustered going back and forth between the Facebook comments and the panelists. This is the first time we've done this type of hybrid format. Please bear with me. I know this is not my finest hour of moderation.
It wasn't your intention.
That's true. It was not my intention. That's fair. But, intent doesn't matter, really, under the Espionage Act, Kevin. Okay, so Marjorie has some good comments. She says, the redactions are certainly justified to protect the safety and lives of the informant, some of whom could be moles at Mar-a-Lago. The Espionage Act has a lot of problems because it fails to make a distinction between people inside the government to share national security with information with other countries to harm the United States, and whistleblowers and publishers who reveal information about government wrongdoing to the public. The Espionage Act, she continues, has been used to go after whistleblowers and, of course, Julian Assange, who is a journalist and a publisher. This is a misuse of the Espionage Act and what it was written to. This is a misuse of the Espionage Act and what it was written to deal with. And then Paul Levy, who has confirmed he is the attorney from Public Citizen, who is one of the leading experts on the First Amendment's right to anonymity in the age of the internet. He has filed some very interesting legal briefs defending people who are posting on the internet anonymously from having their communications unmasked. Paul, I think you're going to have to be on a panel in the future. I think you've volunteered yourself through your comments today. And he has said that the bottom line seems to be that theories being deployed against Trump are consistent with a line of previous cases that are troubling to those of us on the left, but it is chickens coming home to roost. The distinction that other panelists are drawing between deployment against folks fighting for transparency and hoping to reveal data in the public interest, and Trump, who seems to have taken this stuff home to show off to his buddies, is an interesting one. And that's Paul from Public Citizen, who is a very smart commentator who I respect a lot. I respect everyone a lot. Marjorie, Carey, Kevin, obviously. Carey, as someone who has spent a very long time writing a book about how the Espionage Act has been abused and how it poses a threat to freedom of speech, how do you feel about its use in this case?
It circles back. I think I don't have Facebook up, but I saw Paul's comment and want to look up some more of your work after this. But I saw the line, the chicken's coming home to roost. And I very much agree with that. And I think that circles back to what we were talking about now, is this normalization and the setting of precedent without necessarily the full line of criminal process. And that's actually one of the key themes of the research that I've done and in our book on the Espionage Act, is you have a lot of cases where the government has inched closer and closer to lines, but not crossed them yet. I think historically we have a tendency to look at failed prosecutions as victories in terms of a victory legally for a potential defendant, or a victory in terms of the rule of law and precedent. But this is not typically the case. If we look back at the Pentagon Papers case, where there is a huge fanfare that the restraint that was pursued by the Nixon administration. This is celebrated, I mean, in most legal textbooks as one of the paramount First Amendment victories in modern legal history. But the reality after that case was that the Nixon administration kept bullying these news outlets, and the publication of the Pentagon Papers about the Vietnam War trickled to a halt. I mean, most of these news outlets that litigated this case at the Supreme Court didn't actually publish much after that. And there are smaller outlets that were still pursued in criminal proceedings for years after that under the Espionage Act. So just because a process doesn't go through till the end doesn't mean it's a victory for the underlying cause, in this case, freedom of the press. And I think that's what applies to the Trump case, and why it's dangerous right now is that this effectively legitimizes and normalizes use of 793E as a basis for searches of former government officials as well as current government officials in a way that is not legally distinguishable from potential searches of journalists, of non-U.S. citizens. I mean, that's what Marjorie brought up, what we're seeing with the Assange case. He's neither a government official of the U.S., he's not even a U.S. citizen. And yet the provisions of the Espionage Act are being interpreted. It's the DOJ's position that they apply to him. So that's why I think the stakes of the Trump search are so high.
So I want to bring this to the sort of big picture question that I think is necessary when we're having a panel of civil libertarians reacting to this affidavit. Speaking for defending rights in dissent, probably our biggest issue historically has been reining in the national security powers of the FBI. We were originally founded as a group opposed to the House Un-American Activities Committee. There's a memo from Hoover about us, where he basically says that trying to abolish HUAC is the same as trying to abolish the FBI. If you abolish HUAC, the FBI will be next, because they're so closely intertwined in how they operate and what their aims are, which should make you pause for a minute and think about what the purpose of the FBI is, to the point where we were a victim of the counterintelligence program. And that abuse makes itself into the Church Committee. And as early as the 1970s, we're testifying before Congress about the dangers the Espionage Act poses to publication of truthful information. We organized the first protests for freeing Chelsea Manning. We were one of the first groups to sound the alarm about Thomas Drake's case. We have a really strong history of taking on the FBI and the Espionage Act, a history that is longer than I've been alive. But on the other hand, one of our major issues for the last 20 years has been executive accountability for torture, for surveillance, emanating from the Bush-era crimes, that we kept going all the way through the Obama era, trying to push for executive accountability. So I do feel like as civil libertarians, we do believe that the president isn't above the law, and he should be treated like everyone else. When he breaks the law, especially when he abuses his power or commits crimes against democracy, he must be held accountable. No more of these free passes like Obama gave to Bush-era torturers, like Gerald Ford did in pardoning Richard Nixon. But on the other hand, this seems to be rehabilitating a lot of the worst aspects of the national security state. And I guess my question is how do we navigate that tension? Do we just have to sort of live with it? Is there any way to do so? Kevin, you've been thinking a lot about this, so I'm gonna put you on the spot here and then go to Carey. And then we'll see if Marjorie's still with us, and we'll read some final thoughts from her on the Facebook.
To me, you just have to be principled and consistent. And that's the way that I've been when it came to President Barack Obama's administration. And that's the way I was with President Donald Trump's administration. And I think when we look at the centers of power, we get away from the different political personalities that dominate the media, and we get away from the different partisan divides that dominate. I talk a bit about partisan whistleblowers that become cause celebs versus the ones that don't get any support from the Democrats or the Republicans. And I see those that do not win political support who are demonized as owing more support than the ones who are able to quickly go and get representation, hold a press conference, and then within a week or 2 weeks, they have a major committee hearing before senators, and they get to present everything they're trying to reveal. And all of those Republicans and Democrats, or all of those representatives and senators, are immediately going to hear their concerns. They're going to move the ball forward for them and take what they're saying seriously. I think we need to recognize where the different centers of power lie and also see the tremendous continuity that you can draw this line from George W. Bush's presidency all the way up through President Donald Trump and his time in the White House and see what has been consistent and hasn't been different. And even if you say that Donald Trump was a unique figure in our politics, which he was, you still see elements of his administration that were the same. And so when you think about, where you want to stand and where you fall as far as this prosecution, you still have to prioritize those civil liberties interests that we're talking about today. You need to put first and foremost, what's a prosecution of Donald Trump going to mean for whistleblowers? What's it going to mean for the flow of information to the media from sources? What's it going to mean for the power of the national security state to reconstitute its power and go after those who are publishing stories that are of interest to all of us that we need to know? And in an era when there is such massive fraud and corruption and there is no accountability, why do we want to empower agents of the national security state to be able to have a greater legitimacy when they go after figures who are publishing stories that are of great importance? Because in many cases, that reporting, what we learned from WikiLeaks and what we learned from these different massive crowd projects where you see a collective of media organizations work together on batches of documents, whether we're calling them the Panama Papers or the Paradise Papers or whatever we want to call them. We see that in covering these leaks and trying to make the widest impact around the world with our coverage, we see that in many cases, that is the only way that you force some kind of response from power that is constructive, that reins in the abuses that are being committed, because the abuses are not being reined in by the courts. The abuses are not being reined in by the executive branch independently. The legislative branch is not acting to rein in these abuses of power. So then it's the fourth estate, and you do have to be mindful of what a prosecution would do. That being said, personally, my final word will be that I do not lose sleep over the fact that some FBI agents went and took documents from Donald Trump because he sat on this material. He was not willing to share it with us. And even if I look at it in the most positive light and it had corruption around the Russiagate investigation, so to speak, like, for example, another type of abuse like what happened with Carter Page and the lies that went into obtaining the FISA warrant, well, I would want to know about that. But I also would want the president of the United States, when they left office, to go take that to a friendly media outlet right away and reveal it to us, and not save it to help them return to political office and help them boost their presidential campaign. And so I am not against the retrieval of documents to put them back into the National Archives, but I have a lot of concern about what the Justice Department is doing to use the Espionage Act to push this forward, which is why I'm so focused on the obstruction charge and then the other charge that is just a records crime that involves the mutilation and the defacing and the sort of things that he was doing to documents, like he was ripping them out of a highlights magazine and hanging them on his wall like he's some child. I think that those different charges are the things that we should try to as advocates, we should say, look, Justice Department, you have laws available. You can steer clear of the Espionage Act and hold Donald Trump accountable. And the best thing for all of us, if we care about civil liberties, is that you don't charge Donald Trump under the Espionage Act, that you use these other laws available for mishandling of information.
And the Espionage Act charge doesn't even carry the most serious penalty of the 3 charges. There's one that carries twice as long of a sentence. So if Marjorie is still on the Facebook, I would love to get her final thoughts, and I'll read them. And then I'm just going to go to you, Carey. How do we balance these tensions between holding Donald Trump accountable without rehabilitating the Espionage Act, and any just other final thoughts you have?
Oh, are there comments from Marjorie first?
I'll get them if I get them. I'm sorry. We have 2 people in the Facebook giving your comments to me, and I'm also moderating and checking the Slack for them. So this is not. Please.
I think you've done a good job. Don't knock yourself.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you.
It's been great to be on the panel. Yeah, I mean, my main take on this is I'd be very curious to see what comes out in the coming weeks in terms of the justifications of the search. I think I agree with Kevin that the other charges seem more interesting, and I think color the scope of what we're really going to be looking at. But I think we're likely to find out a lot more information in the coming weeks, just because of how much coverage is getting, not just in Capitol Hill, but all over the world. I think folks will be speaking to the press, and we'll find out more about the political context. And in terms of the Espionage Act, I think it is really important to keep eyes on the real issues, of course, that normalizing use of the Espionage Act is a bad thing, and that the Espionage Act has been used frequently in the last 100 years in ways that heavily impact freedom of the press, contrary to Trump's lawyers' claim that this is a 100-year-old antiquated law that has never been used until now. And I think that to the contrary, it has been used quite a bit, and we've seen an escalation in its use. So that's why I think folks should continue to keep a close eye on these issues. And I'm grateful, Chip and Kevin and Will and Marjorie, for all your work in this field, because it's just so important.
And Carey, where can people find out more about your work, including your book, which I have been hounding you for an advance copy of for about 9 months now?
So thank you. Yeah. So I've co-authored, it's actually an unprecedented study of the panoramic history of the Espionage Act, as well as some related laws like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which we haven't talked about, but is connected in some ways to the Espionage Act and also implicated in the Assange prosecution. But the title of my book is A Century of Repression, the Espionage Act of 1917 and Freedom of the Press. And it's available from University of Illinois Press. They're opening up pre-orders actually right now. You can email or message me and the formal release date is October 4th, but we're hoping that copies will ship out before then.
And this is an extremely important book, and I've already told Carey that I will help him get it in the hands of congressional staff who I think need to read it. So, and you can always find more of Carey on the Primary Sources podcast episode he did, where he goes through the entire history of the Espionage Act. It's a very long episode for a law that's never been used, as Trump's attorney said. And I would actually recommend perhaps, I would recommend Donald Trump find another attorney, but I would recommend his attorney listen to Carey's interview where he mentions so many cases where it has been used. Kevin, where can we find your work?
Yeah, if you go to the dissenter.org, thedissenter.org, thedissenter.org, it's a project of Shadowproof, which is my media organization. And we cover whistleblower stories and follow all the latest developments in Julian Assange's case. And I guess now we follow what the legal liability is for a former president under the U.S. Espionage Act.
And I'm a paid subscriber to the Dissenter. I recommend everyone else do so as well. It is an incredibly valuable source. And then we have Marjorie's final thoughts, and I really want to thank her for bearing with us on this. We were not expecting technical difficulties, and it was her idea to go on Facebook and give comments, and that was a very innovative solution, and I'm extremely grateful that she actually worked with us to come up with a solution. I think a lot of panelists would have just, checked out and called it a day. So I 100% appreciate Marjorie helping us with this. Marjorie wrote, I agreed that the other code sections besides the Espionage Act cover what Trump did, and Section 2071 provides for disqualification for holding federal office. That will, of course, become a political football, but the bottom line is that Trump and other presidents in general are not above the law and must be held criminally accountable. It remains to be seen whether Merrick Garland will actually charge him with federal offenses. If he doesn't, we're in deep trouble. Marjorie writes a regular column for Truth Out. It is one of my go-to readings every week or whenever it comes out. She always has very insightful commentaries on the legal issues of the day, and she does so with an excellent political analysis. She also co-hosts Law and Disorder on WBAI, which I believe broadcasts on 150 stations. She is one of the best legal commentators we have today, and I'm very thankful she was able to participate via Facebook. I wish she had been on face-to-face with us, but technology is not our friend, is something I keep telling people. And my name is Chip Gibbons. If you want to learn more about the work of defending rights in dissent, please visit us online at rightsinDissent.org. There are many resources about the Espionage Act, about the FBI, other panels like this one. You can find our previous panel with Thomas Drake, John Kiriakou, and Jesselyn Radick on the Espionage Act, setting the record straight. You can follow us on Twitter at Rights in Dissent. And if you liked this panel and you liked the previous panel and you want there to be panels like this, because let's face it, you're not going to see this on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, ONN, or whatever the news channels are these days, please consider, if you can, donating to Defending Rights in Dissent so we can continue to not only bring you broadcasts like this, but continue to be one of the main groups on the Hill working for serious reform of the Espionage Act, working for serious reform of the FBI. We were doing some really fascinating things with actually reforming the Espionage Act so it couldn't be used against whistleblowers and journalists. I suspect Donald Trump has made it so those things are even less likely to move. But I strongly would encourage you to donate to our organization because we're getting this information out when others aren't. Carey, Marjorie, Kevin, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.